What's the scariest sound you've ever heard? Maybe 10 years ago, I was drifting off to sleep. I was startled awake by the sound of loud tires screeching right below my bedroom window, followed by the infamous crunch of metal on metal colliding. But that wasn't the frightening part. That came from the blood-curdling scream that I immediately heard after. I came to discover that a drunk driver slammed into a parked car a few houses over. A young boy had just been playing in that very spot, and from his mother's viewpoint, she couldn't see that the boy had jumped out of the way, just narrowly escaping being smashed. She thought she had just saw her son get pancaked, and I'll probably never forget that piercing shriek she made when crying out. But if you were to ask me today, that scream only makes number 2 on my list. The top spot belongs to whatever that sound was coming out of Susan's guest room. My godmother Susan is probably certifiably crazy. Seriously. But since she's highly functional and super affectionate, everyone just lets her do her own thing. It also probably helps that she's financially well off. I mean, don't bite the hand, am I right? Susan had been married 3 times, but each for very short periods. And for the last 5 years, she's lived in her big house all alone. She often longed for company and really enjoyed whenever loved ones came to visit. That's why back when I was in between apartments and needed a place to stay, Susan basically forced me to temporarily move in. I told her I'd be staying 2 to 3 weeks at most. I only lasted 6 nights. Something about that room just didn't feel right. It hadn't been slept in years. That was obvious. It reminded me of a hotel suite, if you took away the TV and subbed in the creepiest piece of artwork you've ever seen. I asked Susan what it was supposed to be a painting of. She said she didn't know. It belonged to an ex-husband and was hanging in a room she never used. She just hadn't gotten around to taking it down. I tried to get sleep that first night, but it felt like I was being watched. And every time I opened my eyes, I saw a pair staring back at me from the wall. So I decided to cover the painting with a sheet before going to bed the next night. But the feeling of a strange presence woke me up at least 3 or 4 times. And each time it did, the sheet would have already fallen to the floor, once again revealing that demented expression. Day 3, I picked up a box of thumbtacks from the drugstore. If I had woke up one more time to that sheet on the floor, I was calling it an exorcist. As expected, the tacks held the cover in place, but as the hours passed on night 3, the room started feeling colder and colder. So much so, by 3 a.m. I was fully dressed, hat included. Susan cooked us breakfast that 4th morning as we discussed what I experienced, though I don't think she fully understood my concerns. At the end of our talk, she asked me if I thought she needed to call a heat and repair technician. She did, however, grant me permission to move the painting from over the bed to in the closet, and she made sure to bring me in some extra blankets from the garage. But I was hoping once I stashed the art away, I'd feel better. Yes and no. The temperature was comfortable that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear a tapping noise. It was light and rhythmic, like the second hand on the clock, and whenever I opened my eyes again, it would stop. Half of me was telling myself it was all in my head, but the other half knew exactly where it was coming from. It was the wall behind the bed. I popped in my earphones to fall asleep to music. It wasn't what I was used to, but after a while it finally worked. Then I got some relief on day 5. After hearing I was staying at his mother's house, my godbrother Mark dropped in for a surprise visit. He only planned to stay the day, but Susan and I were able to convince him to spend the night before he traveled back home. We even stopped by my new apartment and brought a TV and my gaming console back to his mom's house to play all night. It was just like back when we were kids. Being that Susan had converted the 3rd bedroom into a plant nursery, Mark and I would be sharing sleeping quarters. And since it was his mother's house, I insisted on being the one creating a comfortable space on the floor. Mark slept in the bed, and on night 5, everything was a-okay. I had forgotten all about the tapping by the next evening, but it hadn't forgotten about me. And just like 2 nights prior, the noise was back whenever I closed my eyes. I couldn't take it any longer. I thanked Susan for her kind hospitality. I fed her a lie about my apartment construction being done early, and I spent the next week at a hotel. Now let's skip ahead about a year. Susan had hired contractors to renovate her master bath, and instead of having to walk back and forth to the guest restroom, she opted to simply sleep over there for a few nights, and she too bore witness to the tapping sound. But Susan was convinced it was coming from the pipes on her wall. So when the contractors were done with their ensuite, my godmom already had their next job lined up. That being the case, when they opened up her wall to investigate, they were baffled by what they discovered. The pipes were inspected and regarded as working properly, but the crew found multiple articles of clothing stuffed into a clear plastic bag. Susan said the clothes looked to be vintage, like the kind of stuff that was in style when she was young, but she didn't recognize any of it. And even though she could identify the what and where of the situation, the who, when, why, and how still eluded her. Curious, Susan decided to open the bag and take a closer look. The clothes were dirty, and she said they smelled like mothballs. Nonetheless, she was just as happy to have them laundered and dropped off at Goodwill. As she was folding the clothes to place back in the bag, something fell from one of the pockets. I like to think that most normal people would have just thrown the wrapped up wad of paper away, but not Susan. She told me she unraveled it completely and was staring at a pair of mummified fingers. Then she chuckled. I thought she was just having one of her moments, and I guess she could tell by my silence that I was lost. But Susan had taken a picture with her phone, and before I could protest, she had texted it over. I didn't want to see real fingers. I just wanted to be able to assure myself that they were some kind of toys or props. The thing is, I still don't know. I'm not sure what detached fingers look like after possibly a few decades. Either way, Susan promised she'd throw them away immediately, but against my suggestion, she was still donating the clothes. One thing I do know is, even though she claims there's no more of those tapping noises at night, guess who won't be sleeping over there ever again?